Hi, I'm Emma Clarke, and this is Before the Bar Opens, the podcast about what happens before the music starts. I talk to people who make, use, and love music. Chris Stevens is a composer, radio programmer, and producer based near Manchester in the north of England. He's also a world authority on radio jingles. He's worked at radio stations in many parts of the UK and was based in Dallas, Texas, USA for 5 years, working as creative director for arguably the world's biggest jingle, audio library and music services company. He founded his own award-winning radio station, Chris Country, playing country music for listeners in the UK, which was recently acquired by a country music-focused app, although Chris continues to run the station. Chris now runs DivaWeb and Ignite Jingles, a company that sells sung jingles all over the world, and last year became a co-owner of TM Studios, the company he worked for in Dallas. I wanted to learn more about the allure of the sung jingle. So, Chris, when did you fall in love with jingles?
I was about 10 years old, and my parents got me a cassette radio for my birthday. And for some reason, I recorded the jingles off the radio rather than the songs. So this is something going back now over 30 years. And they've always been in me. It's really weird. I have no reason why it was jingles, but it was.
What's a sung jingle?
To me, a jingle has to be sung. A sung jingle is kind of when you listen to the radio and it sings the radio station name. If you're listening to a commercial and they sing the advertiser's name, that is a jingle as well. So for me, a jingle is something with a melody and some singers on it. And then the other sort of related thing is what I would call a sonic logo, which is a melody, such as, for example, like the McDonald's da 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 da. That is a sonic logo. I mean, everyone defines these things a bit differently, but that's what I would say.
Why are sung jingles so popular in radio programming?
They've been around a long time, and I think it all goes down to the power of a melody and the power of recall. So there's a couple of reasons why. One is to do with how radio stations get their audience figures. And the system, which varies around the world in different ways, but a lot of it is down to recall. So when you're filling in the diary of what radio stations you listened to, it's like, oh yeah, I was listening to Heart, for example, and you know you're listening to Heart because you can remember their jingles. And so that's one of the reasons why. But that ties into the fact that jingles are memorable and that they've always worked for anyone who's got a brand or a message. A jingle has always had this memorability about it, more so than a spoken liner. And it's that way that humans can remember melodies and hum them. And we can all remember the ones that we grew up listening to, even if we've not heard it on the air for many years. So like in the UK here, if I were to go, you get the shake and vac and put the freshness back, I bet you can continue that jingle.
Totally, you're right back there, aren't you?
Yeah, even though we've not heard it actually on the air in probably 25 years. These things get in our heads.
I can see the woman in the dirndl skirt with a little sort of bobbed hair. She looked a little bit like the woman off Butterflies.
And she was overly enthusiastic. And we remember these things.
Chris is a man who really loves jingles. I love his enthusiasm and passion for jingles. He understands their purpose, their structure, their meaning, and how powerful jingles are in creating the sonic branding for businesses, big and small. Major companies rely on the jingle to make their brand memorable. Jingles help people to sell more stuff. Fact.
There's been surveys recently in the States that some advertising jingles in the States have a recall of like 95% of consumers, which is a ridiculously high number of people. And this is companies who've had the same melody for decades on end and have just stuck with it all the way through. And they just get in your head. And one day, it's like a song. Songs get in your head as well. It's like, you listen to the radio and a song comes on that you've not heard, again, maybe in decades. But you still know the words and you can still remember the melody and the chorus. And when you think about the number of songs we hear and the number of pieces of music that cross through our ears, that's incredible that the brain can remember all of these things over so many years. I was listening to some Buddy Holly the other day, and my mum used to play Buddy Holly, and I could still remember the words to these songs that I'd not really paid much attention to in decades. But also because I'm a musical geek, I could remember the chord progressions as well. And I love chords, and I knew kind of how the song was going to resolve and all this kind of stuff, even though I'd not heard it in decades. And my drunken party piece, and clearly none of us have been to many parties in the last couple of years, is that if I've had a pint or two, normally of cider, and there's a piano, if you name the song, I can give it a pretty good go because I can remember the chords, and the chords are the backbone to songs. And if you've got that kind of that love of music in that way, then you get to remember this stuff, and it's fun, and it normally brings on more pints, which is a good thing.
There are loads of different kinds of jingles across radio programming. You know, we've all heard them. There's news intro, love in the afternoon, rise and shine breakfast show. What is your favourite type? Do you have a favourite type of jingle?
I've always loved the typical kind of sung jingle on the radio that lasts 7 or 8 seconds and is normally like maybe after the adverts or between a couple of songs. I get to write those now and produce those, which is so exciting. I think there's a real skill to writing an entire song that lasts less than 10 seconds, and it has to start and then do something and communicate a message and end and match the mood of the radio station. So I've always loved those kind of jingles. But also, and to give an example, I think the BBC News jingle that David Lowe wrote about
Oh,
25
I
years ago.
love that. I think it's so powerful, that one.
It really is, and it works in so many ways. And again, this is very geeky, so I apologize for the geekiness. But if you listen to the way it's used on the regional TV shows, it's different to the way it's used on BBC Breakfast or used on the World
What's
Service.
the difference?
They have different chords, different intensities. So the BBC Breakfast version is a little more welcoming and reassuring because you're starting the day and you want to know that the world is okay. You know, the mood of BBC Breakfast is a more friendly show than, for example, the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news. You know, there's a version that's used on the Amazon Echo. If you have your flash briefing in the morning with BBC News, there's a version that's on there, and it's evolved over the years. But it's still, I mean, it's one beep repeating itself.
Yes.
Around that, there's chord progressions that will work with one note that's repeating itself. And the way that's been changed and evolved over the years is fascinating. And the way that different versions of one piece of music can convey different things is fascinating. So that's one that I really admire.
What are the essential musical elements then of a good jingle?
It depends what it's trying to achieve. I think the melody, the hook, is really
The memorable
important.
bit, the bit that 95% of us are going to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. The bit that that the client or the radio station wants you to remember, that's obviously really, really important. So certainly that melody, that hook in there. Quite often we'll use that melody with an instrument, maybe starting the jingle as well. I think that the musicality then depends on how it's going to be used and where it's going to be. But normally the whole point of a jingle is that it gets remembered.
I guess that's its kind of sole brief, really.
It is real. Yeah, I mean, yes. What we then often do is say we're doing a jingle package for a radio station. We'll take that melody, but maybe make 10 different jingles that all use that melody. So they'll have different tempos or maybe different musical styles. My colleague Greg in Dallas wrote a jingle package that I loved, that every jingle actually changed musical genre within the jingle. So it
Wow.
might start Motown and end as a singer-songwriter jingle, or start rock and end disco. So there's that kind of stuff. So it very much depends on the world around it. Radio jingles, live in a world of music. Advertising jingles live within that commercial. So it depends on what's happening around it as well.
And I guess really understanding the objective of that particular jingle.
Well, yes, because there's a client. With the BBC News one, the client is the BBC, or whether it's an insurance company or a restaurant or a corporate company, and you'll often hear now, particularly like with car companies, they have a sonic logo that they want to use across all of their advertising. So whether it was the zoom zoom that was used for a long time, often there's now an international thing. If it's a big international company, they want to have a piece of music that represents their brand, and then you can get really deep in what does the brand represent and all that kind of stuff as well. So there's always a brief, there's always a client there wanting a jingle. One really fun project I've been working on for 15 years now, incredibly, is for a radio station is called Jack FM in the States, and their brief is they want every jingle to not sound like a jingle. So
Right.
everything we do for them is not your typical jingle. So we find every musical genre that you would never expect to use, and we use chords that you would never expect to use, and it's like there's no melody that runs through it because they want to be the anti-jingle. But that's the exception. Normally, it is a very straightforward brief from a client, and you want to make them happy.
What are the most popular chords used in jingles? Are there kind of go-to chords for brightness, for cheeriness? Are there like a kind of stock chords almost?
It depends on where that jingle is going to end up. I mean, the vast majority of pop songs are based around 1, 4, 5, and minor six chords, and just always have been as the root of them. As a result, a lot of jingles end up following that pattern as well. But when you go back and listen to particularly Dallas jingles from the 50s through to certainly recently, there were really complex chords, and a lot of these, and particularly in the vocals as well, these really complex chords were what made the sound of those jingles and what made Dallas famous for jingles. And one of the co-owners of TM, one of my colleagues there, Greg, he's got jingle chords in his head that you and I just would never understand because he grew up in this world, and his dad was singing on jingles, and these progressions of fantastic chords were very much what made that traditional jingle sound. There was a kind of rebellion against that over the last 20 years or so, and then jingles followed songs a lot more with the simplicity of the chords. And now it's interesting. There's kind of people who like one or the other. So it can be very simple chords. I've heard some great jingles that basically only have one or two chords in them, but have really an interesting melody line and stuff. Or at the other extreme, there are these big complex chord progressions where within 8 seconds it might change key twice or something like that, and end on a hanging chord because it's sort of then leaning into the next song. So there are different ways. I try and throw something interesting in when I'm doing stuff. So often I'll base mine around maybe fairly simple chords, but then try to have something going on in there. But it also might be a rhythmic thing, actually. So it might be that you're working with fairly simple chords, but you're going to throw something rhythmic in. Maybe have a 2/4 bar in the middle of a 4/4 piece, or if it's a traffic bed, maybe write it in 7/4, just so it's got a bit of urgency to it. So it doesn't feel quite so comfortable almost because you want a bit of urgency for the travel news. But as a piano player and as a lazy piano player, I always start with the chord of C. And then I go to myself, no, Chris, you're always writing C. You've got to do something else. But it's also interesting, actually, I find as a keyboard player, if I write a piece in a key that I am not as comfortable in, it'll take me to different places.
Yes.
And that's actually good for me because otherwise all my stuff will sound the same. And so I find that quite a useful thing. But as well, I write as a keyboard player would write. I have colleagues who are guitar players, and they write from a completely different starting point because they're guitar players. And I find that really interesting.
How does it differ?
When you're playing the keyboard, you're used to playing with, two hands on the keys with the sort of the range of notes that you can play with those two hands, and the way you move between chords is very different on a piano than it is on a guitar.
Yes, yes.
And I can play three chords badly and slowly on the guitar. And my lockdown thing was supposed to be learning the guitar, but instead I learned how to make frozen margaritas. So, you win some, you lose some. I hear pieces written by guitarists and they start in ways I'd never think of starting because, I just play around on the keyboard when I'm starting out writing a new piece. And I presume they start out by just, playing around on a guitar. It's just a different approach. With a guitar, you can only play a maximum of 6 notes at once because there's only 6 strings. So that limits you. And then just the way your hands move in a guitar limit you in different ways. And I hear stuff written by guitarists. I think I never would have written like that. I wouldn't have ever thought to write like that on a keyboard. And I think that's really exciting and really fascinating and really cool.
So, what's the weirdest chord you've ever used in a jingle?
Phew, there's a good question.
An F major seventh with an added 11th or something, or
I avoid seventh and ninth chords a lot because they were kind of cliche jingle chords
yes.
of the 80s and
Yeah, does that date a jingle? Does it kind of put it in a sort of different time period?
I think it does. All this, it depends a bit on then in the mix, how high those notes are in the mix and so on. I have somewhere I'll put a ninth in because it can be a very warm ending to a jingle. I have go-to chord progressions as well that I really like, from a major seventh to a minor seventh and stuff like that. And I have to break myself away from my go-to chords because otherwise I just end up using them again and again and again. I like when I was taught in A level music was called a feminine ending, where the bass is on the key note, but in the case of piano, the right hand is still resolving that, even though the left hand has finished resolving. I like stuff like that, and I also like it's really interesting. I did A level music and I loved A level music, and at one point I was hoping to go to like the Royal Northern College or something like that, but I just didn't practice enough. So I was never going to get there. I was taught things from my brilliant music teacher, Mr. Tennant, about like you never have rising fifths and you never have doubled thirds
Yes.
and this kind of stuff, which was sort of drilled into me.
All counterpoint stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a lot of this was around 4-part harmony stuff. And of course, you can break any rule in anything. You're not supposed to start any sentence with the word "and," but you're a voiceover, Emma. How often do you get scripts where sentences start with the word "and"?
Every damn day, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it works, So, the rules are there to be broken, but I think it's always quite good to have a bit of a, if you know what the rules are, you know when to break them and why to break them. And
Yes, exactly.
I've worked with imaging producers in radio for many years, and I've led imaging teams at radio stations in the past. And I always think for anyone working in communication and broadcast, a bit of knowledge of music is so useful because just understanding the rhythm of stuff is so useful, and knowledge of some chords is great. I always wanted to fund my team to have piano lessons, and we never really got to it in the end just because of life and everything else. But that initial understanding is such a useful base, and rhythm in particular
Yes.
is so useful. And with editing words and so on, it's a really useful thing. It's like, for example, the word sport. The emphasis is on the p of sport rather than the beginning of the s noise. And that's the same with singing. And it's really interesting in jingles, actually. Words that look simple on paper and then aren't when it comes to singing, and words that look like they'll be short but actually aren't short because there's a lot going on. I mean, take my name, Chris, example. In theory, it's a one syllable word, but actually there's quite a lot going on there. You got the grit, and then it's on the end. Chris. It's like a turn while you're saying it, which means that there are some phrases sung quickly. It'll be harder to get that into. You then get into the world of whether the word favorite is two syllables or three, because it could be today's favorites or it could be today's favorites. And this kind of stuff varies then on the local dialect of the area. So, there's stuff like that. I will, before we sing a jingle package for a station, I will check into this kind of stuff.
Defining that house style is really important, I'd imagine, so that when people tune in, they hear the jingle, they hear the music around the station, they know exactly where they are. It helps them navigate what they're listening to.
Yeah, and it also depends on what people say in that place. I did a jingle for a radio station in Australia, and the singers were Australian, and they said, "Yeah, you wouldn't say Australia, they'd sing Australia." And yeah, this is the kind of stuff that
It's so
I live in.
subtle, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. But it's also so important because this is someone's local radio station, and that radio station is representing that locality, and so it's got to be right because it's their identity. And if people are listening and they can't even get the radio, the area correct, then
You've blown all credibility.
yeah, completely. So that stuff really matters. And then also, like in the word variety, over in the UK we variety, in the States is more of a variety without the T in there, becomes a D. It reminds me about 5-6 years ago, I was doing some jingles for a station in Denmark, and we were like, well, we can go to Copenhagen and we can sing them there, but we'll just try it with our singers here in the UK and see how it sounds. And they sent us pronunciation guides, and we sang a little demo. And I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty close. Sent it across, and the client came back and went, nowhere near. So, which in a way as well is quite reassuring, because it'd be very dull if there was no locality and nothing unique, then it'd be really, really quite dull.
I love hearing Chris talk about jingles, what makes them work, what they're made of, and also the history, the lineage of jingles. They may be small, but they're mighty. How do you compose jingles? Do you literally sit at a piano and write it on staff paper?
I only use manuscript paper if they were going to have a rhythm session in. So that would be like, bass, drums, guitar, keyboard. If we got a rhythm session in, I would then score out a basic piece, mainly to show like where the hits are, or there's any particular rhythms. I'll mark the chords on there, and I want to get that balance between making sure they're all going to hit emphasis at the same place, but at the same time not overly prescribing what they're doing because they know their instruments individually better than I do.
Sure, and just allowing for that extra improvisation as well.
Yeah, completely. Absolutely. And I do everything on starting from keyboard into Pro Tools, which is my editing program of choice. Then, as I was saying earlier, how bad my guitar playing is, if I need guitars for a jingle, I will then send it to a guitar player with normally with really bad MIDI guitars on and many apologies in my email to them for how awful they are. Because again, I'm playing bad MIDI guitar like a keyboard player would play. And I will sort of let them know maybe the chord structure that I'm using. Very few people seem to want anything on manuscript paper these days, I find. Um,
That's interesting.
yeah, no, it is, and I think it's just a sign of now we use technology so much more than we used to.
Wow.
That we do vocal at TM in Dallas. We do vocal sessions that are still scored out for the more complicated
Yes.
chords, and when you've got 4 or 5 singers in the room, each have got a separate part. So those are still scored out, but I rarely score anything these days. I can if need be, but it's not very often. But most of the stuff I do is just sort of played in now, and I will listen to if they want stuff that sounds like the genre of music they're playing. I'll get really into that genre. So I did a package for a station in New York that plays bachata music and sort of reggaeton and stuff, and I immersed myself for a month in the music format, and I was listening to the radio station, and I had all the Spotify playlists up to really get into it. But was also sense checking all the tracks that I was writing as well with the radio station to make sure it didn't sound like a guy in Manchester bluffing it, and that it actually sounded proper. And then I got some specific musicians on that. Did a package for a station that plays Bollywood music, and got a sitar player to do all the sitar stuff, and it was beautiful. What he was doing, really, really beautiful. I thought he was somewhere in India. It turns out he was in Derby. He was 50 miles away from me. Incredible. So I'll always try and get genuine musicians on what I'm doing.
Can any singer be a jingle singer?
Probably in the end, but not straight away. It's a very specific kind of singing in that you've got about 4 seconds. The performance is 4 seconds
Yeah.
to sing, but also there's subtleties, particularly if it's a group vocal. There'll be scoops in certain places. You'll be holding to a certain point. There's a certain amount of vibrato normally going on in the vocal. 2 or 3 times now, I've done casting sessions, open calls for people to come and audition as jingle singers. And I'm always amazed at how few people actually really are suitable for jingles.
Yes.
And I say that with not as an insult, because all of these people were brilliant singers. Um, it's just a very specific area, and there's a right amount of energy going into it, and also with a group vocal, it's to do with the kind of voice as well, because the voices need to blend right. So you don't want one voice that's going to stand out, because then they become the sound of that group, and actually you want the group to be the sound of the group. And there are people who are far better at this than myself as well. I've been very lucky with the people I've worked with, but there's that blend going on. There's the sort of the vibrato stuff. There's the different ranges, the vocal range that you need the right combinations.
And diction as well, I'd guess, that they can understand
it's
exactly just how the words need to be formed
Yes.
to match the brand of the radio station and to blend with all the other singers as well, presumably.
It's also very different from a live performance. It's very different to singing in front of people, because a live performance has a wider range of expression going on in it, whereas a jingle, you're in and out, and that's it. And you might be singing 10 syllables at most, which means that each syllable matters so much, because that's the whole thing. And we multi-track vocals a lot of the time, and so you've got this stack of vocals and of harmonies, and every part matters, because it's all in there. And this is someone's identity. This is, whether it's a radio station or a business or a corporation or whatever, this is someone's identity that we're singing. It is a really specific thing. And when I moved to Dallas and I wanted to find new singers, I presumed that all singers or most singers could do jingles, and I was really, really surprised, and I learned a lot. But on the flip side, I can't write songs at all. my writing area is jingles, but that doesn't mean I could then write a pop song. I write longer pieces sometimes for clients. I wrote a brilliant 30-second piece about chlamydia for the NHS once. It was fantastic in the style of Skyfall as well. It was lots of fun. But generally,
Did it have lyrics?
it did have lyrics.
What were the
Yeah.
lyrics, Chris?
The lyrics were written by a brilliant marketing agency called Tadar, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
I know Tadar Media very well.
Yeah, and I used to work with a lot of the Tadar people in former worlds, and they wrote this brilliant set of lyrics that I then created music for, and it was really really good fun. So yeah, I do write longer things from time to time, but yeah, jingle singing is a very unique thing, and the jingle singers that I work with are brilliant because also there's a speed thing going on with jingles because we're all, much as we love the art of what we're doing, we're also all running businesses, and we need to make things work from a business side. So you could be in a 3 or 4 hour jingle session doing 25 jingles perhaps. So you've got to be able to get it really quickly each time as well, because there's economies of scale going on, and for the sake of everyone involved in the chain, from the client through to the studio and so on. So although it's a very creative thing, it's also okay, this is the jingle we're doing now, these are the notes we're singing, let's do it.
How do you decide on the creative direction of a jingle company? Do you try and have your own house style that you then take to your clients? How do you get your own house style defined?
I think your sound is kind of almost self-defined from who you are and how you do things.
Yeah.
And it's very nuancey, but if you play me a jingle, I can probably tell you what company it comes from 99% of the time, because every company has their own sound. And I think that just comes down to the people involved,
Sure.
the systems they're using, down to the mixing and the mastering and the talent they have on their tracks and singing their jingles. It's a skill that's won me no pub quizzes over the years, I must say. But I didn't set out to have, when I created Ignite Jingles about 10 years ago, I didn't necessarily set out to create an Ignite sound, but it happened because it's me writing it. And then that means along the way, you then have to decide actually how much of your sound do you want and how much do you want to try and break away from it or fight it.
That was the next question I was going to ask you, really. How much of you do you want to bring to it and how much of the client? I guess it's a delicate balance sometimes.
It really is, because also people, buy jingles from me because they like the sound of my jingles. So it's getting that balance between evolving but still supplying what people want. Because if you don't evolve, obviously, you'll get to a point where people are like, oh, well, it all sounds a bit old now, or sounds the same, or whatever else. But this is the same problem. It's like, the difficult second album, isn't it? It's like, if you really like Coldplay's first album, what are they going to do in the second album? How far are they going to push you out of that comfort zone? Because if it all sounds the same, you might go, well, this is like the first album. But if it's completely different, you might be like, whoa, what the hell happened there? So it's that middle area, that evolution. And the nice thing with a jingle company is that actually you can do a bit of both. You can write a package that's completely off the wall if you want it, because it's not like that's the only package you're going to write. You can also have one that's very, very what people would expect, and one that's very not, if you want to.
Sure.
And be in both of those lanes simultaneously. But I think everyone does have their sound and their way of doing things, just because we're all individual humans.
As a composer of jingles, I guess it'd be easy to fall back into familiar styles and patterns. I wanted to know how Chris makes sure his jingles sound current. How do you adapt to contemporary musical styles? How do you sort of move on in the world of jingles?
Well, it depends on what kind of radio stations you're working with. Obviously, the sort of the top 40 stations, the music moves really, really quickly. So that evolves. And, a jingle package written 5 years ago for a top 40 station wouldn't sound current anymore.
Sure.
Interestingly, something TM started doing before I rejoined them was they've remastered some of their big 80s and 90s jingle packages that were written for top 40 stations, and now classic hit stations are buying them. So
Wow.
It's like a whole new lease of life for these awesome jingle packages that were written going on 30 years ago. I try and stay current with what's happening in music. But also, we're all getting older all the time, and we're all turning into our parents as we do so, and we're all listening to younger music going, what? So there's some types of music I can do really well, but there's also times when you have to sort of say, okay, there's probably someone better for this than me, and maybe I'll be the person to mix it or to market it or whatever, or help with the creative process. I used a different composer for some Ignite stuff about 3 years ago for the first time that I'd ever done that. I'd written everything myself, but I needed to have some really contemporary stuff. So I used a different writer. And he created stuff that I would never have thought about doing. Partly the sounds, partly some of the chords in there. And interestingly, I also was teaching him kind of how to write a jingle as far as the form and structure of the jingle,
Yes.
which he picked up really, really quickly. But he was bringing all these sounds, and I was like, wow, yeah, that's really, really cool. And it was just his natural world of music. And that was really exciting, and that brought stuff that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And one of the things I love about working with TM, the company in the States that I work with, is although we write some stuff ourselves, we also use a whole range of really cool and awesome composers who just bring in ideas and sounds that we maybe not wouldn't have thought of ourselves. But also, actually, the amount of jingles we have to write and create means we couldn't just do it ourselves. We'd be burnt out the whole time. But it really excited me. Every time I hear something that I wouldn't have thought of, it really, really excites me. And it's a bit like, as well, if we pitch for something and we don't get it, I'm always really excited to hear who does and what they do. Because if they've come up with ideas and sounds that maybe I wouldn't have thought of, I'm like, actually, yeah, that's really cool. I like that. And anytime I'm using the word competitor in inverted commas here because I'm a massive jingle enthusiast. Every time I see a tweet from a different company that's got a new package or whatever, I'm always excited to hear it because I want to hear new things and different things, and things that will then probably challenge me to hopefully do better in the future. And I get massively excited by jingles. I know it's a weird phrase to say, isn't it? But I really do.
All the show notes for this episode are available in the description, and there's a bunch more stuff at beforethebaropens.com. Before the Bar Opens is created by me, Emma Clarke, and is produced by Rick Watson. I composed the theme music. If you'd like to leave us a voice message and maybe be featured in a future episode of Before the Bar Opens, check out the show notes and follow the Leave Us a Voice Message link. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, hopefully a lovely one, and tell your friends. Another episode will be along very soon, so don't miss it. Thanks for listening.